Of the House of Commons Standing Committee on the Status of Women. Hi, guys. I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of members. Hi, everybody. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretations for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. And for those in the room, please use your earpiece, and you will find, you may already see this, your English, French, or floor options as well. Although this room is equipped with a powerful audio system, feedback occurs. Events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to our interpreters, so I'm just going to remind everybody, just be careful with your mics, be careful with your earpieces, just take those all things into consideration on their behalf. And a reminder that all comments should come through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, just raise your hand, and for those on Zoom, raise your hand as well. So today we're going to be continuing with the Bill S25, and I am going to give this trigger warning because after my husband watched this the other day, he said it is mandatory that we give a trigger warning on this. So before we welcome our witnesses, I would like to provide this trigger warning. We will be discussing experiences related to violence and assault. This may be triggering to viewers with similar experiences, and if you feel distressed or if you need help, please advise the clerk, look at me, whatever we can do to help, let's get through this all. And now I would like to welcome our witnesses, and it is wonderful to have our witnesses here today. I would like to welcome in the room, we have Emily Coyle, Executive Director for the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies. We have Sarah Nyman, the Senior Director, Legal Services of Native Women's Association of Canada, who is on, I'm just trying to see, right there, so that's Sarah there. And Roxanne, I'm going, okay, where I'm looking. Roxana Parset, who is a staff lawyer for Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, and we welcome her online. What we'll be doing is be providing everybody 5 minutes for your opening statements. I ask that you to keep them to those 5 minutes so that we can get as much time for question and answers through. So when you see me start moving my arms, please recognize, bring that down within about 15 seconds, okay? So today, as we continue with Bill S205, I would like to invite Emily for the first 5 minutes. Go ahead, Emily.
It's on. Can you hear me? We can hear you. Okay. Thank you, honorable members and chair. It is such a pleasure to be with you today, although, as you say, this is a very difficult topic. I work as the Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies, and our work is predominantly situated here on the territory of the Algonquin Nation, although our work takes place across Turtle Island. We work primarily to address the persistent ways that criminalized women and gender diverse people are denied their humanity and excluded from community. And to begin, I wish to delve into the recommendations emanating from 2 recent inquiries that relate to intimate partner violence: the Renfrew inquiry, which happened not too far from here, and the Mass Casualty Commission from Nova Scotia. Both inquiries advocate for treating intimate partner violence as an epidemic, emphasizing the necessity for a comprehensive, all-government effort to eradicate this pervasive form of violence. They also underscore the urgency of epidemic-level funding for gender-based violence prevention and interventions, urging a society-wide response. The Mass Casualty Commission specifically highlights the vital need at Recommendation 16, and I quote here, to prioritize women's safety by shifting funding away from carceral responses towards primary prevention, including addressing poverty and promoting healthy masculinities. My focus today then is on the carceral response to intimate partner violence, that is, the electronic monitoring piece contained in S205. Obviously, we share the goal of addressing and preventing intimate partner violence. Women and gender diverse people disproportionately experience IPV due to the ongoing patriarchy and misogyny that we all experience. And this is even more pronounced for the Indigenous women and gender diverse people that we work with who are contending with colonial oppression and also experience higher rates of intimate partner violence. Many of the people that we work with and alongside have experienced such violence. Data from the Correctional Service of Canada indicates a higher prevalence of physical and/or sexual abuse among the women and gender diverse people that we work with in prisons. Now, these people represent some of the most vulnerable members of our society. Despite these stark realities, those we work with are not considered ideal victims. And this can lead to insufficient contemplation of the consequences of implementing carceral solutions like electronic monitoring in their lives. Legislative changes aimed at protecting vulnerable populations necessitate a critical examination of potential unintended consequences. In pursuing our goals of eradicating intimate partner violence, we must ask, could our efforts inadvertently render already vulnerable individuals more susceptible? With regards to this legislation, I question whether it will effectively curtail intimate partner violence in Canada, or will it divert necessary resources that could be invested in prevention? Will it genuinely address the root causes of intimate partner violence, namely misogyny and patriarchy? I leave you to answer these questions for yourself. Historically, well-intended legislation rooted in carceral responses has backfired, causing more harm than good. For instance, I'm sure you've heard of mandatory charging policies in intimate partner violence cases, which were obviously initially lauded by the violence against women sector. However, these resulted in dual charging, punishing both parties due to the perceived inability to determine the instigator, even though the quote-unquote weapon that may have been used by one party could have been a child's toy, thrown as they flee. Similarly, there's a tangible risk that if this bill passes, the most vulnerable individuals may be the ones end up wearing the electronic monitoring bracelets, further exacerbating their marginalization. The associated stigma with wearing these bracelets could intensify the challenges faced by individuals who are already overly surveilled and overly punished. You are all very aware of the statistics regarding the over-incarceration, or some refer to it as the mass incarceration of Indigenous women and gender diverse people in this country. It is a crisis, and it is shameful. Electronic monitoring, as a reactive carceral response, falls short in addressing the deeper issues surrounding this violence. Tackling gender-based and intimate partner violence requires a multifaceted approach that delves into the root causes of harm. Our focus should shift from a carceral response to a more sustainable long-term approach. Survivors have emphasized the need for social workers, financial assistance, housing, culturally specific. Can I have 10 more seconds?
10 only. Oh.
Thank you. And I think that these also involve national awareness campaigns, a basic universal income, easily accessing counseling services, and acknowledgement that intimate partner violence is a societal issue, not a private one.
Thank you so much. And we're going to continue on with Sarah Nyman. Sarah, you have 5 minutes.
Hello, bonjour, and bonjour, honorable committee members and chair. Thank you for inviting NWAC to bring Indigenous women's voices into your study of Bill S-205 here on unceded Algonquin territory. The Indigenous women, girls, two-spirit, trans, and gender-diverse people NWAC represents remind us that it is one thing to be heard in these hallowed halls, but it's another to see change in their communities. Indigenous women are much more vulnerable to domestic violence than other women in Canada. They face the highest, most disproportionate rates of domestic violence and are being targeted in an ongoing MMIWG genocide. In this committee's study of Bill S-205, I want to talk about power. Bill S-205 gives victims more power, but it does not account for Indigenous women's systemic disempowerment. Here's what I mean. Bill S-205 would not have helped the Inuk woman and domestic violence survivor in RVLP at the Quebec Court of Appeal in 2020. She was displaced from her community by colonial policies. She was unhealthy because she lived in poverty and without supports to get well. She was dependent on her abusive partner and vulnerable to his repeated and increasingly aggressive physical and sexual assaults. If Bill S-205 had been enacted at the time, she would not have gone to the police for help or asked a court to lay in information to protect her. Violence is one of the key means through which abusers control women's agency and power, and this Inuk woman was not empowered to ask for help because in her lived experiences, and that of most Indigenous women, is that the police are not there to protect them, and the trust is broken. Indigenous women recently told NWAC that on the one hand, police are always watching them, ready to catch them violating a condition or alert social workers to remove their children from their care. But on the other hand, when they are being abused within their homes, the police don't seem to be watching close enough to be able to step in. This distrust poses a significant barrier that will prevent Indigenous women from accessing the victim supports intended by Bill S-205. This bill must incorporate Indigenous justice principles. Many Indigenous legal orders hold specific laws against gender-based violence. They hold offenders responsible, and they aim to repair relationships between the victim and community. Victims also have a role in determining the abuser's punishment while receiving healing services of their own. Indigenous communities need Indigenous-led approaches to resolving gender-based violence, and they need resources and supports to do this work. Much of this need is reflected in the findings of the MMIWG Calls for Justice. NWAC recommends this committee amend Bill S-205 by adding conditions under Section 515, subsection 4, that are recommended by Indigenous governing bodies with the authority to govern the accused. Where this bill allows a provincial court judge to lay in information before any physical family violence occurs, it could go further and mandate judges to consider the available Indigenous support services. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples directs legislators, including this committee, to work with Indigenous people to protect Indigenous women from all forms of violence. Before I conclude, I want to raise that it is very important that this committee study Bill S-205 in a way that does not worsen Indigenous women's mass incarceration. Canada's correctional investigator recently updated that Indigenous women make up more than half the adult prison population. In some prisons, this is as high as 75%. We heard in the other place that Indigenous women often face double charging when police attend a domestic violence call. This means police charge both the aggressor and victim. At bail hearings for these charges, courts are still using unnecessary and unreasonable bail conditions against Indigenous people at disproportionate rates. NWAC agrees with the amendments to Bill S-205 that removes some reliance on electronic monitoring, but presses this committee to remove all references to them. As a grassroots organization, NWAC walks with Indigenous women who seek help. We can provide resources, toolkits, and supports, but there are systemic forces at play that are much too powerful for our organization to remedy on our own. Bill S-205 must go further to account for Indigenous women's lived realities if it's going to help reduce violence for all victims, especially the marginalized and vulnerable within this group. Thank you, and NWAC remains available for further questions. Miigwech.
And thank you so much. We're now going to move online where we have Roxana Parsa with LEAF. Roxana, you have the floor. A little bit more difficult to get a hold of you, so I'll probably interrupt 15 seconds in to say, hey, 15 seconds left.
Okay, great. I hope you can hear me.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Good morning. My name is Roxana Parsa. I'm a staff lawyer at the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, also known as LEAF. I'm grateful to appear today from what is now known as Toronto, which is on the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Wendat, Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee nations. LEAF is a national charitable organization that works to advance the equality rights of women, girls, trans, and non-binary people through litigation, law reform, and public education. For the past 38 years, LEAF has advocated for the need to improve the justice system's response to gender-based violence. We are grateful for the opportunity to be here today to share our views on this bill. I'd like to start by expressing appreciation for Senator Boisvenue's efforts in addressing intimate partner violence. Intimate partner violence accounts for 45% of all violence reported by women. These risks are greater for women who are Indigenous, Black, and racialized, as well as for women with disabilities and migrant women. These risks are also greatly increased for people who are two-spirit, non-binary, trans, and gender non-conforming. Responding to intimate partner violence requires an immense systemic approach that considers the needs of diverse survivors of violence. However, we encourage committee members and all parliamentarians to resist focusing on the criminal law as the sole response. Taking a carceral approach and expanding provisions in the criminal code does not address the systemic issues which underlie violence. We are concerned today that the focus on electronic monitoring in this bill diverts resources that could instead be spent on preventive measures and direct support of survivors, while also increasing surveillance and promoting a false sense of security. Before sharing our concerns, we would like to first commend this bill for its provisions sharing information with survivors during the legal process. As we've all heard numerous times, for many survivors of violence, the process of reporting an incident and engaging the legal system is re-traumatizing, and often does not offer what they need to move forward with justice and safety. Survivors are often left in the dark, unaware of their own rights during the process. Requiring judges to ask prosecutors whether the intimate partner of the accused has been consulted, as well as providing them a copy of the bail order, can have a positive impact by providing survivors with much needed information. This is a positive step towards an approach that considers survivors an integral part of the criminal legal system. However, we remain very concerned about this bill's focus on electronic monitoring. We understand the desire and the intent behind exploring more paths to safety for survivors, but in our opinion, electronic monitoring serves as a band-aid. Electronic monitoring does not necessarily function as an effective means to increase safety. Reliance on this technology can lead to malfunctions such as false alarms and delayed notifications. This risk is heightened in remote and geographically isolated communities where a lack of connectivity and sometimes extreme weather conditions can also cause monitoring systems to fail. These failures lead to an inability for law enforcement to effectively respond. And in effect, while some survivors may feel an increased sense of safety, this does not translate into reality. Electronic monitoring is also already available to judges as an option, and through Bill C-233 was recently introduced into the law specifically in the context of intimate partner violence. This proposed legislation is redundant and serves to increase surveillance of offenders and their families, many of whom may already be from over-surveilled and marginalized communities. As Senator Payne has pointed out, studies in the U.S. show a disproportionate use of electronic monitoring on racialized and low-income families. Finally, electronic monitoring devices are expensive, costing hundreds of dollars a month. When we are thinking about how to best spend resources, we need to think about what will have the most meaningful impact. We urge the government to reconsider spending valuable resources on criminal legal solutions that have not proved to protect women. These are resources which could be allocated into services that provide direct support for survivors to have the mechanisms to seek safety. While new laws can give the illusion of concrete action, the criminal law is not the solution. Repeated legislative amendments and expansions have not reduced the number of deaths. Moreover, when policing is seen as the primary solution to intimate partner violence, it inadvertently excludes survivors from marginalized communities who may not seek this support and only deepens the existing inequities in seeking safety. The answer, we suggest, is properly supporting and funding education, prevention, frontline services that respond to the needs of survivors while working to end gender-based violence. It is time that we look beyond the criminal legal system and focus on our resources on developing the social systems that are necessary for violence prevention. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. So what we'll be doing is starting off with our first round of questions. It's 6 minutes each, and we'll pass the floor now to Dominique. Dominique, 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Merci.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you to our three witnesses for being available today. I would like to come back to what we heard from two domestic violence victims that we heard from earlier this week. I'm a little surprised by what I heard this morning. We're having very different views on tools that we would like to implement. We've heard a lot about therapy and changes to Section 810 that needs to be modified, and the use of the electronic bracelet. And this is something that is currently being tested in Quebec. I don't think that the bill that's in front of us is saying no to rehabilitation. That's not the goal of this bill. And it's not supposed to hinder the rights of anyone. We want to do as much as we can to protect victims. I would have something to read, Madam Chair, if you wouldn't mind. An extract of the testimony from Martine Janson.
The bells are going. There's lights going on in the room. So we are going to stall for a second and ask. I'm not sure what the vote is on. Do we have a closure? Okay. But we do have a vote that the bells have just gone. So, pardon? One moment. We have to address you and open you because your mic wasn't open. What I need to do is bring it to the committee because we need to decide how to proceed. We have, of course, options. We can continue for another 15 minutes if people wish to walk across and vote in person. We can continue in the room and and all vote by device. And I'm seeing that right now people are looking at their devices as the option. Those are some of the decisions that we have. So it needs to be unanimous on this. So here's the choice. We can work up to another 15 minutes. How would we like to proceed? I'd like to hear from the committee. Go ahead.
I think if we vote with our device, we can even push it to just 5 minutes before the vote and then come back with the witnesses, because we have some very important witnesses to hear.
Okay, so, yeah. So I'm just going to ask everybody okay voting with their devices? So we'll vote with our devices. So what we'll do is there'll be a couple minutes where we're all looking at ourselves on the phone. We apologize. We're really not that vain here, but we recognize the importance of hearing from everybody today. So we will suspend for a couple minutes prior to the vote so everybody can get in, do our things, and then once everybody's voted, back to work. And so we'll spend at that time. I'm going to pass it right back to you, lady. So we are going to start. You've got 4 minutes and 28 seconds remaining.
J'ai été interrompue dans mon élan, mais je sais.
I remember where I was at. So I will be reading an excerpt of Ms. Janson's testimony. She said that e-bracelets would have allowed her to be protected from the attempted murder by my former partner and would have helped his other victims. Often, we are not warned of the arrival of our partners. We worked with a group of 100 women on this project, and they are all victims of domestic violence, and multiple were victims of attempted murder. Currently, the only thing that we have is the e-bracelet. I worked with hundreds of women over the last 20 years who are asking for help. There's no way to hide them. Men will always find a way to follow them and commit violence against them. And we need the electronic bracelet. This is someone's personal experience. Women who were followed for years by their partners. And they're saying that we need to adopt the bill and that we need to adopt it without amendments, as is. And I'll end by saying that Senator Boisvenu is somebody who's very reasonable, very calm, very progressive. And he had to go through the murder of his daughter. And he had proof and statistics and was asking for our support for the bill. How can you say that it's not a good idea when there's this bill and you mentioned therapy and Section 810 that would be revised? I think I took a lot of time.
1.5 minutes. Who is your question to specifically?
Madame Coe.
I hope you're okay if I respond in English. It's devastating. I mean, we all have experience in our families, in our personal lives, with our friends. Intimate partner violence, as I said at the outset, is an epidemic in this country, and we are all wanting to do something about it. I come from the experience of most of the people that we work with who are criminalized, who are in our prisons and our jails, have experienced intimate partner violence or violence of some kind. And they continue to be punished and harmed by the way that our criminal law is utilized against them rather than for them. And so we come to any kind of legislative reform with this in mind, especially given that most of the people that we work with are the most marginalized and vulnerable people in our societies. And so we want to ensure that we do this very, very carefully.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I just also wanted to bring the Renfrew inquiry into this discussion, because in the Renfrew inquiry, they do mention electronic monitoring as a potential solution for intimate partner violence. But their recommendations do not go so far as to say it must be implemented, but rather we should be studying it, because we want to be very careful with any kind of legislation that criminalizes or uses carceral responses. Who is it going to harm in the long run, and who is it going to protect?
5 seconds?
45.
45. J'ai été surprise de vous entendre aussi.
I was surprised to hear you compare the e-bracelet to other tools, examining financial resources only. That these resources given to the e-bracelet would take away from other tools, and I would ask that you explain that, please.
25 seconds to respond.
It's very simple. It is among one of the criticisms that I have of this particular tool.
Much. We'll now pass the floor over to Lisa. Lisa, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much to all the witnesses for being here and for your testimony today. And I would just pick up with my colleague, if you want to flesh out that answer a little bit. What exactly do you mean that the resources could be better used? I mean, you said that the electronic bracelets could make women more susceptible, it could do more harm than good. Flesh that out for us. What exactly are you saying?
In my remarks, what I had said was that what we witness every time that there is an attempt to address really critical issues in our society, utilizing carceral responses like dual or mandatory charging or potentially the electronic monitoring bracelet, that what we end up doing is we see how that is utilized because we have bias in our system. We can't ignore that. We have bias, we have racism in our system. It's evidenced by the fact that there are more Indigenous women and Black people in prison than there are white people, proportional to the percentage of their population in our country. And so when you look at responses like electronic monitoring, you would see, for example, sorry? Oh, okay.
Your microphone's on. Yeah. No, it's okay. It's okay. It's all good.
It's okay. You would see, for example, that this could be utilized against the very vulnerable people that we work with, the more susceptible people.
So just to clear that, so you're saying the victims would have the electronic monitoring,
exactly.
and not
That's
the
what I'm worried
aggressors.
about. Exactly. And so we look at another bill, for example, that was looking at bail reform recently, and it looked at the reverse onus provision for people who had a discharge for intimate partner violence. We see women and gender diverse people that we work with often going to domestic violence courts, receiving a discharge because they are told that this is going to let you get back to your family faster because you are the main caregiver. Those are the very people who will then have the reverse onus when they go back to court if there's another intimate partner violence charge against them. It's very nuanced and complicated, but it does harm the people we work with.
And I think, I don't know if it was you or one of the other witnesses was talking about a false sense of security. So maybe Ms. Nyman can talk about that. Is it because we're not sure how well they work, we're not sure how well they work across the country, and women may feel safe when in fact the bracelets aren't working?
I'm going to defer to my colleague from LEAF. That was her point.
Thank you. It is exactly what you're saying. There are many technological faults that can occur using these devices. In rural areas, for example, there might not be a constant signal between a device and the receiving unit. I've read about cases where there's a battery that is, losing power and it causes false alarms or it doesn't work properly. And one of the problems that arises too when these false alarms, okay. One of the things that happens is there's often less attention paid to them if there are false alarms going off. Even in urban areas, there can be challenges with GPS technology. There's something called GPS drift, where the signals will bounce off buildings and cause inaccuracies. And so all of these different technological issues come into play, and it can really lead to, women might feel that because they have this electronic bracelet, there is security, that police will be alerted right away, but it's not really the case. And it can often lead to this false sense of security, as I was talking about.
Thank you. And following up with you, Ms. Parsa, you were also talking about something that you liked in the legislation, and that it gives victims more of a voice in their own security. But I think this legislation also impels victims to give this advice in open court. Do you see any problems with that in terms of being trauma-informed and sensitive to what victims have been going through? Do you think that victims are going to be able to speak in open court about what they need to maintain their own security?
I think that's a great question, and I think it's definitely something that needs to be considered with this bill. Because I agree, I think going to court for any victim is often re-traumatizing, and it can be difficult as well to share your thoughts on security when the abuser is there. Oftentimes, the court becomes a place of abuse, and so I think that is something that needs to be carefully considered with this bill.
So is there anything then that you would keep with this legislation, or do you not support this legislation whatsoever? I'll start with you, Ms. Parsa.
I mean, we support the idea that that victims should be given the bail or order of the bail, and that victims should be involved in that process and heard. But we do not support the electronic monitoring provisions, nor the peace bond provision, as we also believe that it is repetitive of Section 810 peace bonds, and that we question the usefulness of adding this new provision.
And I'll maybe turn to Ms. Coyle or Ms. Neiman. Do you have anything else that you would add to what you like in this legislation? Is there anything you would keep here?
20 seconds to respond.
NWAC honors that this bill gives victims a voice, but questions whether this bill provides access to the benefits intended by this bill to Indigenous women.
I concur with everything that everyone else has said. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We'll now pass it over for 6 minutes to Audreyne LaRoche. Audreyne, you have the floor for 6.
Merci, Madame la
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Neiman, Ms. Coyle, and Ms. Parsa for your testimonies today. We heard from our first set of witnesses on Monday. We had victims who told us about the importance of this bill in protecting them, and they asked us to move forward as legislators. We also heard from the senator. I spoke with Senator Dalphond yesterday, who worked on this bill as well. And they had discussions with different groups and shelters for abuse victims, and they asked Senator Dalphond to work on the adoption of this bill. In Quebec, a lot of work was done through the Rebuilding Trust Report. It has hundreds of pages. It was nonpartisan work. All of the different political parties in Quebec worked on this report with the feminist lens. And it's interesting to see that they were able to have this report with such an important title, because victims currently don't have trust. They need the tools and concrete measures to show them that we are acting. We want to rebuild their trust in the system. We want to hear them. I met with a member of the provincial parliament in Quebec about this, and there is a pilot project using electronic bracelets in Quebec. And we also have special tribunals. And so this allows us to have better trained judges and allows us to better listen to victims. It's being implemented in different areas in Quebec. And there are issues with connectivity, but the senator yesterday was saying that connectivity will continue to be improved in rural areas and remote areas. And the senator is confident that that will move forward. I would like to ask a question for Ms. Parsa. And so remote surveillance is something that judges have been examining, including in Quebec, where they have their e-bracelet program. Have you started examining the results? I know it's a pilot project, but have you looked at what's been happening in Quebec and explain a little bit about what you've learned?
Thank you for that question. I have not been looking too in depth at what has been happening in Quebec. I have read studies from other places in Europe where electronic monitoring has been used. And I think something that is important to point out that I've seen emerge is that it's often found to be successful when it's paired with other interventions and other programming. So it's very rare that electronic monitoring as a standalone measure is a fulsome plan for protecting survivors of violence. So I think that's something that I've seen come up in studies where it's often in alliance with community integration supports, with training, police, with other measures that are more preventive in focus. But I have not read too much of the details of the Quebec situation yet.
Merci beaucoup. Et effectivement,
Thank you very much. And when we look internationally in Spain, and in Spain it has worked, France and Italy are looking to something similar, and Quebec is examining a whole continuum of services for victims. I think the report had about 90 recommendations, and it includes the electronic bracelets. Ms. Coyle, in paragraph 1.2 that amends the criminal code and the conditions in 515, we could add to bail conditions wearing an electronic monitoring device. There was a study at the Justice Committee done on this, and my colleague, who is a spokesperson for justice, has also studied this tool. Judges can already use this tool, and we're hearing that we need to do more, and that's what this bill seeks to do. And we can look at what's happening in Quebec and internationally. The Justice Committee examined this tool. And when we talk about a continuum, what would you add to it? What can we not forget?
I want to remind everyone before I answer that I come here bringing the voices of people who are often forgotten in these conversations. So
you have 15 seconds or less. It's already over the time, so 15 seconds.
Okay. All right. Well, I mean, we need social workers. We need universal basic income. We need robust mental health care. We need accessible counseling services, legal services, drug and alcohol services.
Excellent.
The list goes on.
No, it's perfect. Thanks. You got lots to add. Thank you so much. We're now going to pass it over to Leah. Leah, 6 minutes.
Thank you so much. My first question is for Madame Parsa. Is that how you pronounce it, Parsa? Yeah, okay, super. So I know in the Senate committee on November 16th, 2022, your colleague, Roselle Kim, stated that, in quotes, ultimately electronic monitoring is a reactive tool that provides a false sense of security for many survivors and does not address the systemic causes of domestic violence or the underlying issues that survivors face, like isolation and the lack of resources. So I know we've spoken about other witnesses have indicated that certain groups, I would say Indigenous or over-surveilled, and we know through the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, when there are issues of safety, the very systems that are supposed to protect us don't. So over-surveilled, and when we need support, not. And because of that, we've heard that there's a distrust in current systems. So now we're supposed to rely on the very systems as the main tool for safety that have proven, and we know through research, do not protect us. So can you expand on how the electronic e-bracelets may be a reactive tool that don't address the root causes in our current systems that are perpetuating increases in intimate partner violence?
Sure, thank you for that question. I think it's really important to point out what you were just highlighting, how relying on something like electronic monitoring, which is embedded in the criminal legal system, it really pushes out a lot of survivors from accessing support. Indigenous, Black women, racialized communities, migrant women, many people who will not go to the police for many of the reasons that you've stated. And so this safety mechanism is not even available to them. Like it will not be used by women in these communities. And so I think when we're talking about how this is a reactive response, what we mean is that we need to think about where we're putting our resources, and our resources should be more funneled towards proactive, preventive responses. The real solutions to intimate partner violence lie in investments in community services, in housing, in expanding shelter systems, and providing mental health resources. We see that shelters are constantly full and women are being turned away. These are resources that are being spent on the criminal law that could be turned into an effective and functioning social support system.
Just because I have a limited amount of time, I know the current government has cut $150 million from shelters. We know by the time we have legal interventions, people have either been murdered or they don't want to access the systems in the first place. Why is there a concern that if we put this system in place, we'll see further cuts to resources that keep people alive and safe and give them the programs and services that they need to really exit violence?
I'm sorry, I didn't fully understand your question. You're asking.
There's a concern about that the resource that could be used for things like shelters, prevention programs. Why do you have that concern that those resources would instead be allocated to e-bracelets or the electronic bracelets?
Right. I mean, I guess we can't say exactly which resources the government is choosing to spend, but I think what we can say is electronic monitoring devices are very expensive, and we know this. And this money does not need to be spent on them. It could be spent, and we would urge the government to think about spending it on social support mechanisms, which, as Ms. Coyle has said, the Renfrew inquest and the Mass Casualty Commission recommendations have really pointed to prioritizing preventive work. And that is where we will really see change with intimate partner violence.
So just to add on prevention, one of the things that I put forward as a bill in support of a guaranteed livable basic income, because we know through the National Inquiry Call for Justice 4.5, often people wanting to exit intimate partner violence can't because they don't have the financial resources to. I know that there's been, in terms of the sector that works in JBV, there's almost unanimous support to put in place a guaranteed livable basic income as one of the key ways to mitigate gender-based violence. I know that NWAC supports it. I know that the Elizabeth Fry Society supports it. I believe LEAF supports a guaranteed livable basic income. Why is that necessary if we're going to get real about ending gender-based violence? I'll ask Sarah. Yeah.
So we have 45 seconds. So.
Some of the economic strife that predominantly Indigenous women victims of gender-based violence and domestic violence experience is one key tool in reducing and eliminating gender-based violence, but not the only. And so it needs to work in concert with community-based solutions, Indigenous-led solutions, and building into legislation opportunities and avenues for the legislature to consult with the Indigenous community directly affected.
How long do I have?
You have 10 seconds left.
Okay. If you want to add something, Emily?
I mean, what comes to mind is if you don't have a house, if you don't have anywhere to go, is this electronic monitoring bracelet going to help you in any way?
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you so much. We're now going to start to our next round, but I've gone through the time. 11:49, we will be voting. So by the time Michelle's done, it's 11:49, so we can start off with the first round with Michelle for 5 minutes, and then we'll take the break to vote, go to Anita, and then we'll start the round. So Michelle, go ahead, 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chair. Just a quick question to each three witnesses. I have to be pretty quick with our time. Do you think that policy should be led by victims or sort of people who, work in the industry, but are people who have lived experience? I'll start with Ms. Coyle.
The voices of
Just lived experience or not? Yes or no?
so we bring the voices of people with lived experience.
So lived experience. Okay, Ms. Nyman, do you think policy should be set by people with lived experience? Or people who don't have lived experience?
I have a nuanced answer.
Okay, and to the third lady, I'm not sure your name. Do you think that, thank you, Roxanne, thank you, Chair. Do you think that policy should be set by people who have lived experience or not?
I also have a nuanced answer to that.
So what I've heard here today is, I'm going to be honest, it's deeply upsetting. It's deeply upsetting what you guys have put forward. We've had victims sit in this chair, the senator whose daughter was raped and murdered, who comes from this from a very personal perspective. These victims have testified that this bill needs to be passed with no amendments. I'm curious, you keep going into the prevention end of things. 1,000%. You need prevention. 1,000% you need that. That's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about a bill that will help victims. And it's shameful what you have said here today on behalf of
Point of order,
these
Madam
victims.
Chair. Madam Chair, I
Yes.
just want to ask, do we have any witnesses that are coming to the committee that are Indigenous women? Do we have any witnesses that are coming that are Indigenous black women, that are black women that are coming to the committee?
We've requested all of the, we have requested. That's not a point of order specifically. I appreciate that. Yes.
So I'm just going to go on.
But attacking witnesses is not a
Okay,
good
so
thing either.
just to be judicial with your
I want
comments.
to-
I have a
Thank
point
you.
of order.
Okay, one moment, please.
I just want to point out that we have witnesses here today that work on the front lines and who live this probably every day of their lives. They are listening to victims
also not a
every
point of
day,
order.
and I think it's
Okay.
really
So
insulting
that's debate.
to not
That
even
is,
listen to
I
an answer.
appreciate this, Lisa.
I hear you, Lisa. and
Okay,
I know-
time. Chair has the floor.
Thank you.
I respect, so let's just have respectful language. That is what I ask. And I recognize that we come to this with a lot of passion. And so we may come from very different opposing sides on this. So I respect, but let's just ensure we get the right testimony out here. And Michelle, you can continue with your time.
Thank you. And I do not disrespect the work that you do. It just feels it is shameful what they've said. It is shameful what they've said. So I would like to read into the record what the victims have said. I'm telling you, this is from Martine Jensen. The group of 100 women and everyone we work with, they're just waiting for you to accept the bill. They're just waiting for that. This group is still there. We're giving, they're talking, they're here. So Martine, is this progressing? Martine, where are we now? We go to the women who, this is from Martine as well. The women who don't want to report abusers. However, if they know they are going to be heard, if we start to see that electronic bracelets are being put on, and if we start to see there are judgments in favor of women, they will tell themselves that if they speak, we will put on a bracelet on the aggressor so he will not come back to attack her afterwards. I think what I hear and what I'm saying is shameful. It's not personal. It's that you're saying that criminals are allowed to walk free. What about the women and children who are sitting at home terrified right now? Their attacker is at large. Because of Bill C-5, the Liberals' Bill C-5, you can serve a violent crime, a gun crime, under house arrest. These children, these women are living in fear. And there is a very small window of when you can do this. And that's what this bill does. And that is what I'm saying about it feels shameful what you've said to these victims today. I know the work you do. Elizabeth Fry does amazing work in my community. But it feels insulting what you've said today. The prevention end of it is critical. 100%. That's not what this legislation is. Do we need to teach men how to be kind? Do we need to teach the difference between violence and anger? Yes. Do we need to teach all of those things? 100%. But if you don't see the value that this will protect women and children today, then we have a very strong disagreement. Thank you, Madam Chair. There's no real questions except, are they going to support this legislation? Yes or no would be my final question to everyone.
So we'll start Emily, Sarah, followed by Roxanne.
I want to say we are on the same side. We are 100% on the same side. And it is shameful that there is an epidemic of intimate partner violence in this country, and we all want to do something about it. So I simply bring the voices of the criminalized women and gender diverse people that I work with to these tables because they're often forgotten, and they are the most victimized, vulnerable people in our community.
Our understanding that NWAC was invited here today so that this committee could hear from the perspectives of the Indigenous women disproportionately impacted. And if you want to hear how this bill will impact Indigenous women, then my comments are that they won't be able to access it and they won't be able to benefit from the intended outcomes of this unless you consider making amendments that tailor to their identities as Indigenous women.
Thank you very much. That was the end of the 5 minutes. We are going to suspend to allow us to vote, and then we'll be coming back for continuing with our round. So suspensions until everybody has voted. Everybody, we've all had the opportunity to vote, so we're going to start the clock now, and I'm going to pass it over to Anita for 5 minutes. Anita?
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair. And when Ms. Ferreri asked you the question earlier, first of all, I think that we would all like to respect the expertise that you are bringing here, and thank you for coming and providing that to us. I noticed that Ms. Nyman and Ms. Parsa, you said that when you were presented with a binary yes/no 10-second question, which is, I think, unfair to ask witnesses to do, that you had a more nuanced response. So I would ask both of you, Ms. Nyman and Ms. Parsa, to give us your nuanced response.
Thank you. I mean, a lot of the data and research that my response relies upon are contained within the volumes of the National Inquiry into MMIWG final report. Those tell us the specific answers that inform Indigenous women's experiences. And in terms of their disproportionate representation among victims of gender-based violence and domestic violence, I don't want NWAC's position on this bill to be characterized as pitting different kinds of victims against each other. We are all on the same page in terms of advancing rights and voices of victims.
Ms. Parsa?
Yeah, I would agree with that and say that I think we are all here with the same goal, which is ending gender-based violence. And I think that speaking from LEAF, our work is developed through research and consultation with a range of individuals, some of which are survivors, some of which are experts. And I also think that it's a bit of a false binary to say that many experts are not also survivors. I think intimate partner violence affects a very large variety of people. And I do think that it is important to keep in mind that we are here to bring to light some of the perspectives of the most marginalized communities who are often not here, as Ms. Coyle has said as well.
Thank you, and I very much appreciate those voices that you are bringing here today. My next question is for Ms. Coyle, and I'm just going back to some of the things that you've said. It sounds that a lot of the arguments to amend this bill are around the fact that there are things that are redundant, there are things that may not be necessary, there are things that, well, the money would be better spent elsewhere. But what I'm not hearing is that if this bill would actually cause harm. So, because it's very different when you're looking at something and saying, well, that's already in the criminal law, than to say, well, if this is passed, there will actually be unintended consequences that would not have been in the legislative intent. I also, just to consider that when we did hear witnesses previously, they talked not just about the sense of security or the safety, but also the deterrent effect that, for instance, a bracelet would have, and also being able to prove in court where that person was if they did break their conditions. And I also see Ms. Nyman nodding, so I'll give it to Ms. Coyle, and then if there's time, I'll have the other witnesses also respond to that. Thank you.
I used in my initial remarks the example of mandatory charging as an unintended legislative reform that has ended up really harming the people that we work with. And I'm sure you've heard multiple stories. I used to be a defense counsel. I actually represented someone who used a toy, and that toy was characterized as a weapon. When she was charged with assault with a weapon. And she was defending herself when she was running away, and she threw the toy. And when the police arrived at the home, they had to charge someone, and they didn't know who the aggressor was. And often in cases of intimate partner violence, the person who is harming the other person knows very well how to use the law against the person that they are already harming. And so we have to be really careful when we look at utilizing the new tools in our toolbox to continue to harm people through a system that already has bias at its core.
Ms. Nyman?
Thank you. I'm going to lean on two truths that we hold to be true. One is that disproportionately Indigenous women are victims of domestic and intimate partner violence, and Indigenous women are over-incarcerated in our federal prisons. And NWAC's position on Bill S205, to respond to your question about whether there's unintended harms, just ask that this committee in its study be alive to some of those unintended consequences vis-a-vis over-incarceration of Indigenous women.
Thank you, Ms. Parsa.
10 seconds. We're all done?
Ms. Parsa, 10 seconds.
Yeah, I would just agree with everything that has been said. And I think with respect to the deterrent effect, there is not actually much evidence showing that electronic monitoring has a deterrent effect. Harshness of penalties does not lead to deterrence. And I think also the technological faults.
Yeah. Just wrap it up really quickly.
Just to say, many of the technological barriers that arise can also lead to failures in deterring because they know it won't work properly.
Excellent. So now we're switching over for 2.5 minutes. I'm going to switch it over to Adrienne LaRoche. And 2.5 minutes, Adrienne.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I was thinking of over 100 recommendations, and it's 190 recommendations actually in the Rebuilding Trust report. It examined domestic violence. It examined the courts, prevention, and electronic monitoring devices. And so I'm eager to see what positive impacts these measures will have. This bill was tabled in a specific context. We talked about gender-based violence as an epidemic. Antonio Guterres mentioned that the violence in the region, he called it the shadow pandemic during COVID-19. And we see that some are impacted more than others. In the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls inquiry, it highlighted the difficulties that these women face and how they don't have trust. Ms. Neiman, what could be improved in the bill in order to better support Indigenous women and girls?
Thank you for your question. Our suggestions to the text of this bill to improve it for Indigenous women are to make an amendment by adding a condition at Section 15, subsection 4, by providing courts with the option to look to Indigenous governing bodies who have authority to govern the accused to contribute community-based solutions as part of the conditions.
30 seconds left.
Oui. Pour une dernière petite question.
Ms. Coyle, for a final question, what should we remember on mass shootings? We talked about coercive control and to have more violence recognized.
I want to make sure I understand what you're saying.
Rapidement,
So in the report, we talked about gendered gender violence in the Mass Casualty Commission. I just needed a few seconds to repeat my question. And so there was one of the recommendations to increase the number of types of violence being recognized, including coercive control. And what should we remember from that report from the Mass Casualty Commission?
For that to be in writing, that was just way over time.
Okay,
So,
I will write the answer then. Is that okay?
it's a quick question, a quick reply, and then the rest in writing, please.
Okay, coercive control is a whole other issue that I would love to speak to you about, and I'm also eager to hear about this recommendation from Quebec as well. I think there's a lot to learn.
Perfect. Thanks very much. I just know that that is such a much bigger issue than a 10-second reply. So if you wish to put that in, that would be wonderful, because I know there's lots of work being done on that as well. Leah, 2.5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair. And I just want to acknowledge, I think all of us are on the same page in terms of wanting to address intimate partner violence. And we're all pretty intense about it. I know I've spent a career being intense about it. So, but in saying that, I think on one thing we need to remember as legislators is many of us haven't had this lived experience, and we're making the laws. And so one of my concerns is specifically the fact that the very people who are overrepresented in terms of experiencing intimate partner violence will not even use this system because they're not responding. We know this from the National Inquiry, that when Indigenous women, girls 2S, LGBT, QQIA call for help, whether it's to deal with it or even look for us, nobody shows up. So I want you to expand on that, Sarah. I think you've spoken to that. I would like you to expand on that. You spoke to an amendment. Why is that amendment so critical if we're going to address statistically the majority of people experiencing intimate partner violence?
Thank you for the question. My answer relies upon the lens of the UNDRIP. And what that obligates legislators to do is to craft legislation that takes into consideration Indigenous people's rights. Under Article 22 of that International Human Rights Treaty and domestic legislation, there is an obligation for states to take action to protect the vulnerable, specifically Indigenous women, from violence. Where this bill seeks to reduce intimate partner violence and prevent it in some cases, it's just not tailored to Indigenous women's lived experiences. And so our concern is that while it will help some victims, it won't impact the lived experiences of those who have distrust of the colonial system that oppresses them and who have distrust in the people who are legislated to protect them, but oftentimes don't. Go ahead.
And I guess I asked because we passed a legislation in the last Parliament, Bill C-15. All legislation going forward has to be consistent with the article contained in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Does this bill do that? It's a legal obligation for us now. Does it do that?
No, and I understand that there's not an UNDRIP lens through which each bill is being examined, the same way that we do for the Charter and for gender-based analysis, but we suggest that in the near future, and why not now, that we begin by making sure that all legislation passed aligns with an Indigenous-led approach.
And that's actually Canadian law now.
We're past our time, so I'm now going to pass it over. We're going to do the last couple seconds. We've got 5 minutes to Dominique and then 5 minutes to Sonia. Dominique, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Moi, je voudrais juste...
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. We did mention redundancy with Bill 233, if I remember correctly. They both have different timelines. And so we have a bill that's focusing upstream, and we're talking about women because they're the ones who are the most impacted by this, and they're facing domestic violence. And we've heard some very emotional testimonies. You heard me react Monday. I was shocked. And it was so hard to hear. And I don't know how these women find the strength after being victims of such violence. And the Quebec Association of Native Women and Andréane and I have mentioned it multiple times today, there is the Quebec experience with the e-bracelets. It is a very positive experience, and the Quebec Native Women's Association supported the pilot project. And we can look to the Quebec experience, and that's what we're trying to do with the bill that was sponsored by Senator Boisvenu. And I would like to remind everyone that he lost his daughter. She was murdered. He dedicated his life to that cause in protecting women. I would like to remind you that we heard from Diane and Martine this week, and they told us, and they were very clear, that it is important to support this bill. I don't think anyone here is playing petty politics with this. We are all trying to find the best parts of this bill. And we all heard from the witnesses on Monday who said that they support the bill without amendments. I would like to read an excerpt from what Diane told us on Monday. I cannot tell you how important the e-bracelet will be in this bill. Nobody has said that the bill is the only solution. There are other tools as well in the bill, including therapy and Section 810 needing to be revised. And she continued by saying, when we ask that the bill not be amended, we have our reasons for it. We are here telling you what's happening. If there's anyone who knows what's going on, it's us. We want to protect ourselves, and we want to protect our children. Ladies, I'm hearing what you're saying, and I would like to thank you for what you said and for preparing your speeches. But we don't agree with you, and we just want it to be recorded because we want this bill to move through the different steps. We would like to thank you for meeting with us, but it doesn't seem like we'll be agreeing because for us, this bill is fundamental. It is a significant tool that will concretely help women throughout the country who are afraid for themselves, but also afraid for their children. And so that is why I urge parliamentarians and the witnesses and their associations to reflect further on this bill and to see that, of course, it's not perfect. Nobody is saying that it's perfect, but everyone is saying that it's better than nothing and that we need to move forward. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Very much, and there was no questions from that, so I'll pass it over to Sonia. Sonia, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also want to make a comment before I start my questions. And as my colleague said, we want to find the best of the bill. And policy is not made with the yes or no questions. Nuisance matter. Today, these nuisance meant the perspective of racialized and Indigenous victims. So my question is to Ms. Niemann. In very brief terms, what amendments would you like to see that aim to protect Indigenous women and racialized women?
Thank you for your question. NWAC would like to see an amendment to Section 15, subsection 4, that provides judicial decision makers the option to consult with Indigenous governing bodies when they're dealing with an Indigenous accused or victim.
Thank you. On October 31st, Minister Ian announced $5.5 million for several organizations, including Leave to Prevent the Address Gender-Based Violence in Ontario and across the country. Ms. Parsa, how are you going to approach your work towards the implementation of this funding? And I also want to point out that intimate partner violence can drastically impact victims' lives. What support measures do victims, you're providing when they're experiencing these violence?
We don't provide direct support at our organization, but something that LEAF is very passionate about pursuing is looking at alternative avenues to justice outside the criminal legal system. So we've recently released a report on restorative and transformative models of justice and how survivors who may not want to go to the criminal legal system can seek mechanisms of justice and safety through other models. And so that is an area which we're very eager to continue working on.
It is essential that our criminal code adequately addresses intimate partner violence. We also need to make sure that we are working to stop the problem at its root. What action can government and communities take to improve education and prevention of intimate partner violence? And anybody can chime in. We can start from Elizabeth Fry.
We are spending a lot of time thinking about the issue of intimate partner violence with regards to a specific piece of legislation. And this specific piece of legislation focuses certainly on 810 and increasing the voices of, people who've experienced intimate partner violence. But what we aren't doing is taking a step back and doing what the inquiry into the Mass Casualty Commission asked us to do, what the Renfrew inquest has asked us to do, what the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girl report has asked us to do, what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, particularly recommendation number 30, which asks us to reduce the numbers of people, Indigenous people in our prison. We're not stepping back and doing that. Instead, we're spending all of our time and all of our energy on a very tiny piece of legislation that is not going to do what we need to do to address this epidemic of intimate partner violence. And so survivors will tell you they need social workers, they need universal basic income, financial assistance, housing, culturally specific resources, mediators, domestic violence specialists, shelters, peers, community intervention or de-escalation, faith community supports, legal services, crisis prevention, drug and alcohol services, mental health services. There is a raft of things that we should be doing. We should not be spending all of our time looking at this tiny piece of law that is not going to do what we want it to do.
One thing I want to raise that hasn't been raised today, and I think answers your question, is that proceedings in the criminal court are our versus, the Crown versus, not the victim versus. And one of the things that this bill does that we haven't seen frequently enough is give the victims a voice in those proceedings that previous to they haven't enjoyed. And so NWAC does honor and celebrate the fact that there are now, if Bill S-205 passes, that there will be legislated opportunities that require those who hold all the power to consult with the otherwise powerless victims and ensure that they're at least made aware and consulted throughout processes that typically are stacked against them.
Do you have 15 seconds. Ms. Parsa, you want to chime in?
I agree with everything that's been said, and I would just reiterate that we think it is really time to move our perspective beyond just focusing on the criminal legal system. Prevention work is what is crucial.
I'm just looking at the time. We are right to the very end of this panel. We've used every second that we possibly could. On behalf of the committee, I would really like to thank Sarah, Emily, and Roxana for being on today. Thank you for bringing your perspectives. We are going to suspend because we need to immediately get right back on. We have one check to do, so suspension and starting back in about a minute. to go, so we want to switch it up. I would ask the witnesses from the last panel, we need to move out because our next panel is trying to get in. So, okay, so what we will do, if with our great persons that are working in the room right now, I would like to now welcome, we have two people on this next panel. We have Deepa Mattu, who is the Executive Director from the Barbara Scheifler Commemorative Clinic, and she is on via video conference. And Catherine Latimer, who I'm going to let have a couple seconds here, who is the Executive Director with John Howard Society of Canada. What I'm going to do is I'm hoping everybody is back and good. I'm going to pass it over for the first 5 minutes of to you, Deepa. The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Honorable Chair and committee members. I'm Deepa Mattu, lawyer and Executive Director of the Barbara Schleifer Commemorative Clinic in Toronto. I truly appreciate this opportunity to address you today and to present the submissions on behalf of the clinic. The clinic offers trauma-informed legal services and representation, counseling, and multilingual interpretation, and systems transformation support to women and gender-diverse people who have experienced violence. Our efforts are rooted in foundational principle of intersectionality, trauma-informed care, and resolute dedication to a client-centered approach. In my submissions today, I want to focus on voice of our clients. I will articulate 4 key points in response to the proposed amendments. I will talk about how these changes relate to the experience of survivors of the gender-based violence, the implications for the marginalized communities, an assessment of the current condition of our system, and finally, a recommendation for an evidence-based law reform. Starting with the voice of survivors, I would like to begin by expressing my support for the proposed amendment, Section 515, subsection 3.1. We think it's a step in the right direction to require the justice overseeing a bail hearing to inquire with the prosecutor about whether accused intimate partner has been consulted regarding their safety and security needs. This underscores the importance of taking into account the well-being and the concerns of the intimate partner and provide an opportunity for survivors to explain what they are afraid of and what court's order might help them. We question, however, whether provision goes far enough. Is there a way to ensure that survivors are not only consulted, but that their concerns are actually presented to the court to assess how conditions address them? With a similar view, Section 515, 14.1 subsection, helpfully require the judge to ask if the survivor has been informed of their right to copy of the court's order. We submit the amendment could also require that a copy be provided to the survivor. In the clinic's experience, the survivors can wait for a week to obtain a copy of the bail condition, which are usually very generic in nature, rather than a tailored or a specific safety concern during ongoing legal proceeding. With respect to this amendment to Section 810.03 that creates the recognizance specifically for the situation of intimate partner violence, we recommend additional survivor-centric approach. Protection should be available for both current and previous intimate partners, as our experience shows that violence can persist after partners have separated, and in many cases actually escalate with lethality at the time of the separation. In addition, informants seeking a recognizance should be given the option to attend court on a different day other than the defendant's day. I wish to emphasize that many of the amendments in Bill S-205 are a step forward, empowering individuals who fear potential harm from their intimate partner and reflect your commitment to creating a safer and more responsible legal environment. However, I want to submit that there are inadvertent repercussions for historically marginalized communities from Indigenous background, Black background, non-status, migrant communities, disabled people. However, from our observation, these consequences may include misuse or false accusations against the survivors themselves. You have heard in detail from Elizabeth Fry Society that how system is sometimes challenging for the survivors themselves when they have this complex relationship where they get charged. Chilling effects on reporting, so that's another fear that we have, that the legal repercussions may unintentionally deter those genuinely need for reporting concerns. It is vital to address any barriers that might discourage individuals from seeking protections they require. Strain on already limited legal resources. I'm sure that this committee has heard from other people on this too. There is already a very stretched legal resources issue in this country. Adequate measures should be implemented to manage potential backlogs and maintain the efficiency in the legal system if these amendments go forward. Stigmatization of the accused individuals. We must be vigilant about the unintended societal stigma that accused individuals may face, even if later proven is innocent. Public perception can have lasting impact on people's personal and professional lives. It can also lead to increased criminalization of marginalized communities, survivors who don't speak English, survivors who are from the migrant communities, and Indigenous and Black survivors. I submit that changes to the legal landscape like this need to go hand in hand with additional legal aid support for survivors and options.
You have about 30 seconds left. 30 seconds.
And options for free, independent legal advice to ensure fair and informed process. I want to say that I also share some of the concerns that were presented around the electronic monitoring and the bodily substance sampling. At the end, in conclusion, I would say that the voice of survivors echo with an urgency that demands our attention. The fear of domestic violence is just not physical. It is a pervasive threat that lingers in the shadows of survivors' lives. It is our commitment, in your commitment of transforming this system, I ask you that you think about the call to the action for a framework that is not only dedicated towards breaking the cycle and building a future without.
Thank you so much. I know you're trying to get so much in. And what I'll do, I know that you've sent in speaking notes, so perhaps we'll ask that those can be sent out to the committee so that everybody can get all of that information that you did send, okay? I know there's tons there. In the room, of course, we have Catherine. So, Catherine, I'm going to pass the floor over to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, committee members. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank you very much for seeking the views of the John Howard Society on Bill S-205. As a charity, we're committed to effective, just, and humane responses to the causes and consequences of crime. So the John Howard Society is concerned about preventing crime and about appropriate and effective consequences for having committed crimes. Preventing intimate partner violence is a shared goal, but our assessment is that there's very little in Bill C-205 that would make a difference in terms of preventing violence. So Bill S-205 amendments really pertain to two areas. One is the judicial interim release provisions or bail provisions, and the other is the new category of reconnaissance orders relating to the fear of domestic violence. So in terms of the judicial interim release provisions, there is a heavy reliance, as the other witnesses have mentioned, on electronic monitoring as a condition of pretrial release if it is sought by the Attorney General. We would first point out that the research on electronic monitoring has been inconclusive in terms of its effectiveness in preventing crime. Secondly, the technology is very expensive, and it is important to know who would be paying for the device and for its monitoring. Given that it is the AG who is seeking it, can we safely assume that it would be the AG who is paying for it? That's not always the case, and often individuals who are released on bail or on community sentences are being asked to pay for the monitoring. And this actually worsens a class bias in the criminal justice system in which the affluent are more likely to benefit and the marginalized and impoverished, including members of the Indigenous and Black communities, are more likely to be denied. The reverse onus provisions that are being proposed in subsection 515 sub 6 mirrors the contentious provisions that were included in Bill C-48. Which makes prior discharges as equivalent to convictions for triggering a reverse onus provision for bail for prior intimate partner violence offenses. Many witnesses appearing before the Senate on Bill C-48 cautioned that including discharges would raise charter concerns. There's also a retroactive application to this provision, which is troubling. Many accused, including women, who are also often charged when it is unclear who initiated the domestic conflict, might have agreed to plead guilty to an offense that might otherwise have been successfully contested at trial on the understanding that the discharge would have no future negative criminal justice implications for them. Now it would. In any event, the equivalent of this section will have already been accepted or dropped in Bill C-48, making this section duplicative or possibly inconsistent with the will of Parliament. The second major area is the reconnaissance orders, and our view is the proliferation of 810 orders to reflect the fear of certain types of future crimes is unnecessary and bad policy. Existing sections 810, which specifically refer to intimate partner violence, and 810.2 are adequate to cover those fearing domestic violent offenses. It should be noted that the proposed intimate personal violence reconnaissance in this bill is triggered by a fear of a personal injury offense. Yet Section 810.2 reconnaissance is triggered by a fear of a serious personal injury offense, indicating that the latter category applies to persons who pose more of a threat of serious harm. Yet Bill S-205 proposes much harsher treatment of the former for the 810 than for the 810.2 orders, and this will create a sense of a disproportionate, unfair response based on the severity of the risk posed. There was also some amendments to the Youth Criminal Justice Act, but I won't get into those for fear of running over.
45 seconds.
Yeah. Okay. In conclusion, the John Howard Society of Canada urges the committee not to pass Bill S-205 at this time, as the House has unanimously passed Bill C-48, and the bill is now in the Senate, which gave attention to the issue of intimate partner violence during bail process and already includes a key measure that is proposed in this bill. 2, the range of Section 810 reconnaissance orders are already adequate to deal with the fear of intimate partner violence, and the proposals in S-205 are disproportionately harsh. I agree with what the witnesses had to say before. The criminal justice system has a very limited range of tools that it can use to assist with intimate partner violence, and the better answers lie outside the criminal justice system. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm looking at the time, which is 12:32, meaning we have 28 minutes. I'm looking at everybody to say there's a few suggestions, one round where we get 6 minutes and then a lightning round for a couple for 1 minute each, or we could just kind of go reduce it by a few minutes so that we get 2 rounds through. We're all good? I'm looking at anyone's divided it. Okay, so I'm just going to go. We're going to do 4 minutes for the first round, and then from there I'll redivide up my time. Okay, so 4 minutes. We'll start off with Dominique for 4 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Madame Latimer, merci de vous être
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Madimer, for being with us. We have the transcription from the witnesses that we heard from on Monday. They said that the e-bracelet would allow for a safety perimeter between the victim and their aggressor and would also prove a breach of conditions. I had reported my aggressor, but he came out unscathed where I didn't. We need to be heard and respected in our basic rights and needs. That was from Diane Tremblay, who testified on Monday. I'm a bit surprised. I think you were in the room earlier, and so I'm a bit surprised that you're saying that we shouldn't adopt S-205. Very surprised. I can't even find the words, actually.
Technical reasons as well as substantive reasons for not proceeding now with with Bill C-205. The primary one is that the Parliament has already looked at almost the exact wording of the provision in the judicial interim release reverse onus provision, and so it will already have made a determination. That bill, Bill C-48, includes a review provision so that the effect of that those particular provisions can be looked at and more changed if need be.
J'ai très peu de temps. Vous avez entendu, Madame la Présidente.
I have very little time. But we heard from the witnesses and we see the experience in Quebec, and this is pushing us to adopt Bill S-205. I don't see how any technical aspects could convince us to not adopt S-205. I'll stop there because I don't have a lot of time, Ms. Madimer. Ms. Mathieu, You're online. I can't hear you. Hello. Ms. Mathieu, if I understood correctly, you agree with the bill, even though you would like to see some improvements, correct?
I agree with some portion of the bill. I don't agree with the entire bill, and I don't agree with all the amendments that are being proposed. But I do agree with the voice of the survivors that's being proposed in the bill.
Madame Matou, est-ce que vous avez pris connaissance?
Ms. Mathieu, did you hear the testimonies that we heard on Monday?
No, unfortunately, I did not. I'm sorry.
Est-ce que
the excerpts that I read earlier, do they not reflect the reality and concrete proof that women are urging us to adopt S205? They experienced it. They help hundreds of women. Shouldn't that be enough to convince us to act today?
10 seconds.
Unfortunately, because I haven't seen the transcript, so I can't say you should be convinced or not. But I'm absolutely, if you think that you should be convinced. But what I want to say is that maybe what you need to also hear from is the survivors who unfortunately see themselves getting criminalized in the system.
Excellent.
And I think that's the piece that is missing in the equation.
Thank you so much. We're now going to pass it over to Emanuela. Emanuela, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd like to begin by thanking our witnesses for being here, the ones who are on the current panel, but also the ones on the previous panel who have come here to express the views that they have, given the fact and all of their experiences working with these communities who are underrepresented, who are overly incarcerated. I appreciate the views that are being brought forward because it's important to take into account all perspectives when putting forward legislation. And so I just want to make sure that that is that it's known that I very much appreciate your presence here today. I guess to both of the witnesses on this panel, you've spoken to some of the shortcomings in Bill S205, and I'm wondering, you specifically mentioned shortcomings with regards to prevention and how the bill does little to actually prevent intimate partner violence. But also, you mentioned the fact that it could put certain communities, more in danger than they already are. It could make certain victims, get the negative parts of this bill applied to them as well. And so it'll just increase the amount of inequality that exists in our society. And I'm hoping that you heard the previous testimony as well, because there were certain recommendations that were brought forward by the previous witnesses, including amendments that could be made to the current bill in its current form. Is there anything that you would like to add in terms of specific amendments that haven't been mentioned already that you think can help bring that prevention piece in, or that you think can help help those who don't feel protected by the justice system and by police and et cetera? What are some of the things that you think we should be including in here if we weren't to completely reject the bill and we were to pass it eventually? What is missing from here? If you can be a little bit more specific. I'll start with Ms. Mathieu because I see you on the screen, and then we'll go to Ms. Latimer. Thank you.
Thank you. So two things that I think are real, in addition to what I said in my proposed amendments in the beginning, two things that are really important. In none of the amendments proposed, I see any connection or any comprehensive approach that addresses the causes of the criminal behavior. So there is nothing which explores the integrating of mental health services, addiction treatments, and social support to facilitate that sense of rehabilitation. So while there is a lot of emphasis on these new conditions, there is nothing to say that these conditions should also work with all of those other services, which are really crucial for preventing criminal behavior. I also think that the language of the bill, especially around the recognizance conditions, there is ambiguity and there is a lot to be left to the interpretation and the application, and which can lead to legal challenges. That's one thing. But also, I think there needs to be some concerted effort so that the system is not actually laced with the bias that we are currently facing for the marginalized communities, and there is a clarification of the legal language for more consistent and transparent application. So those would be two things. If the bill has to pass, those will be the two things that I would say should be considered. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Latimer, do you have anything to add?
You have 15 seconds, Ms. Latimer.
Thank you very much. I don't have much to add, except that I think that what has been proven successful in terms of reducing intimate partner violence, and more work needs to be done, is working on preventing repeat offending. And my hat's off to the government's initiative on reducing the federal framework to reduce recidivism, and I think more work needs to be done on that in terms of dealing with prisoners.
Thank you so much. I'm now going to pass the floor over to Adrienne, 4 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Latimer. Thank you, Ms. Matu, for being with us today. And thank you for sharing your perspectives with the committee. I'll start with you, Ms. Matu. At paragraph 515, the judge must verify with the plaintiff that they were consulted regarding their needs, their safety needs. Currently, 515.3 states that a judge needs to verify if there was a threat made against the victim. If the victim is not the intimate partner, is there anything else that should be done to protect the intimate partner or the victim?
In many situations, the person is not necessarily an intimate partner, so that intimate partner language can be very restricting. So I am really glad that you asked that question. And in terms of what additionally needs to be asked is about where is the threat coming from, who is this person, and also what is the safety concerns that are being raised, and what are the safety resources that are being offered. I feel like as I said in my submission, I think the language right now proposed is very minimalistic, although I really, really celebrate that there is a proposal to create space for the voice of the survivors, but it seems that it is very limiting, and there needs to be more inquiry into what is going to happen in terms of once someone discloses the threat. You can't just ask what threat you're facing and not propose what will be the safety offered to the person, and that's the complete missing link.
Est-ce que vous avez pris connaissance de lois?
Are you aware of any other legislation here or abroad that forces a judge to verify whether or not a victim was consulted for their safety or security? In Spain, for example, there are similar measures. For example, the e-bracelet, and Australia and other countries are looking at measures that are similar to ours. Have you examined any other instances abroad?
In my area of work, one area that I am really keen on, which could be potentially utilized, is actually making sure that there is the voice of the survivors heard through an expert risk assessment done, which is actually focused on survivors' experience and not necessarily just focused on the perpetrator, which currently, unfortunately, happens. And if there is that expert opinion taken from a court support worker, maybe a social worker who's working with the survivor, and looks at the risk assessment and looks at the indicators of the risk and the safety planning, that could definitely be very helpful for a judge who's making the decision and making sure that the decision is really holistic in nature. So my work in my work here at the clinic, that's the area of focus that we have been advocating for and asking for. And there is definitely room for that amendment here.
Dans quelques secondes, est-ce que vous envoyez...
Quickly, do you see any issues with implementing this paragraph? Would judges have any difficulty implementing it?
I mean, other than the fact that our system is already overboarded and overburdened in terms of the resources. So from that perspective, I do feel like there might be not enough time, or there will be delay in the system. But legally speaking, I don't see that why there should be a problem in hearing from an expert while asking the prosecutor to support the judge in that process. There is a huge...
Thank you very much. We're passing it over to Leah. Leah, you have 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. My first question, sorry, I'm just getting, I'm wasting all my time. Matu, Madame Matu. Yeah, so you spoke a little bit about recognizance orders that are in the bill, and you expressed some concerns about that. You said it's concerning. Can you expand on that, please?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for asking. My concerns are that in our experience here at the clinic, I just want to share with all of you, we receive at least 5 calls every week of women survivors or gender diverse survivors who were living under coercive control and now experience criminalization because of the mandatory charging. Now, my challenge with these changes is that we know that there is criminalization of survivors from specific communities and racialized communities and Indigenous and Black and non-status and migrant communities. This change could create an environment of false accusations which are coming forward from actually aggressors, the men in our case, and that can create a chilling effect on reporting from the survivors. So while in notion, I think it is an excellent idea that there should be a room for people to come and get support and step forward, and it gives them that empowerment. But there is a real practical challenge that can create strain on the limited resources, and I would not want a survivor to access this without getting independent legal advice. So that's a big piece of the puzzle that I haven't seen anywhere in the bill. That is, are survivors expected to do all this by themselves? So while this can be weaponized against them, they themselves, when accessing it, also
so
need
it
proper
places,
support.
just because I have limited time, you're saying it places victims of the violence at greater risk? The way the bill is? Okay, so I'm going to leave it there because I do want to ask Madame Latimer a couple of questions. So this is where my concern is. We know that the justice system is riddled with systemic racism. And you made some comments before. Are you concerned that this bill is a bit premature because we haven't dealt with existing systemic racism in our justice system already? Like, does it place people who are already overrepresented, or in the case of what Madame Matu said in terms of the victims, often Black, Indigenous people, placing them more at risk of actually being criminalized, victims being criminalized? What are your thoughts on that?
I think the mandatory charging policies, though well-intended, have led to a lot of people who are actually more likely to be victims than perpetrators being charged with the offenses, and that coupled, there's attempts made to try and correct that by giving people discharges, right? So they get absolute discharge. You know, it was probably a mistake that you were charged in the first place, but we have mandatory charging policy, so we had to do it. So they're stuck with a charge. They try and address it by giving them an absolute discharge. But absolute discharges are now going to be part of the provision that leads to a reverse onus on bail. So you could end up seeing further numbers of Indigenous women and Black women facing pretrial detention unnecessarily because of this bill.
That are victims.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's certainly, in terms of research I've read, I think that's one of my main concerns. I understand, I want to be very clear, the good intentions behind the bill. Would you be in support if there were amendments to the bill? Or do you think the whole bill, you just don't support it?
What I'm going to do is, because your time is up and we do have one final round, we'll be able to use you'll get the question at the end. I'm looking at the time. You guys know how sticky I'm with time. We are down to 10 minutes. I thought we had 15. We're down to 10. So, Michelle, 3. 3 over here to Sonia, 2. Go ahead, Michelle, for 3.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the witnesses for being here. If I could ask both the witnesses, one of the things that I think has been a bit conflated today is that this bill is about the rights of victims, not prevention. It's not intended to be a preventative measure. Do the witnesses believe this bill will give more power and voice to the victims? I can start with you, Ms. Latimer.
I mean, there already is a Victims' Bill of Rights, which is supposed to be giving victims voice in all decisions being made by the criminal justice system. So there's already something on paper, and if that's not actually resulting in people getting access and having an opportunity to give voice, then I'm not sure how much more paper changes are actually going to deliver that. There needs to be an operational change and not just a legal change.
For the record, I know that we were supposed to have the Liberal minister update those Victim Bill of Rights, but it hasn't been done. So regarding bail reform, the Liberals passed Bill C5, which allows dangerous sexual offenders to serve their sentences out on bail. You can imagine how this makes victims feel. So given this legislative change, do you think that victims deserve initiatives and policy and legislation such as Bill S205 to give them more rights? Obviously, they're going to be consulted regarding electronic bracelets, which gives them a lot more power. So I will go to Ms. Matteau to answer that.
Thank you so much for the question. So in terms of should we have more client-centric and victim-centric, as I use the language survivor-centric language in the bills, and should there be more law reforms around that? Absolutely. But my point in response to you is that none of the law reform should be without evidence-based approach. There should be funding of appropriate research around law reform. There should be an impact assessment of law reform and the bills. There should be implementation of external independent evaluation of previous inform the new changes, and there should be funding for doing all of this work. So unfortunately, the reason that you're hearing a lot of us having a visceral reaction to the fact that this might actually deepen the problem than solving it is from our experiences on the ground, that there are lots of survivors against whom the same laws which are meant to protect them are weaponized.
Thank you.
I hope that helps.
How much time? I have 30 seconds left. My colleague Todd Doherty, who's sitting in today, just has a quick question.
Thank you. I appreciate the testimony. Ms. Latimer, was it your testimony today that criminals who are released with electronic monitoring, some are told to pay for the monitoring?
Yes.
Do you have evidence of that you can commit or to share with this? Because during this time, I've actually spoken to a friend of mine who's in the RCMP, and he says that's not even plausible. And so I'd love to, if you can table that evidence with this committee. I think it's because I hate to call you say that your testimony is wrong or mistaken, but I would love to have that evidence if possible.
Sure, I can do that. I actually used to contribute to help someone pay for their electronic monitoring
Perfect.
devices.
Thank you much, Catherine. So if you can make sure that's sent in, we'd really appreciate it. We're now going to pass the floor over to Sonia. Sonia, 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, all the witnesses. My question is to Ms. Matteau. Ms. Matteau, you talked about the cause of the criminal behavior, mental health, you talked about the rehabilitation. So what testimony can you give me to the committee in the importance of such approach when dealing with the racialized survivors and marginalized communities?
In terms of the causes of the gender-based violence and intimate partner violence, it's very well documented from various researchers that mental health, addiction, poverty, and homelessness all go hand in hand in terms of the experiences of the survivors and the perpetrators who commit these crimes. So in the conditions that are being proposed in the recognizance, I didn't see anything that was proposing that there will be an attention paid to all of those supports along with other conditions that are being proposed. And that's where my submissions were around the fact that you can't really solve a problem by just putting more restrictions and impositions and make it more criminalized environment for people instead of actually giving them supports to actually rehabilitate themselves. And that's what the basic ethos of the criminal justice system is.
Okay. Ms. Latimer, can you talk about the priority to the support to the survivors? Is this bill, amended can reinforce existing support systems that protect survivors? Can you talk about that?
I am not sure the extent to which this bill or others are actually protecting survivors. I think, frankly, recognizance and the 810 orders stand a good chance of keeping people who are aggressive with each other apart because there is a legal, order that they stay apart. They're not foolproof by a long shot, but I think that the existing 810 orders make sense. I worry that the order that's being proposed here is going to be found to be disproportionately harsh given the other restraining orders or recognizance that are meant to deal with serious violent or serious personal injury offenses, and this is only meant to deal with personal injury offenses or injury offenses. So there is a problem there, but I think that is probably your best shot is looking at these Section 810s.
Thanks so much. What I'm going to do is I'll pass it over. Let's stay close right to the 2 minutes. Adrienne, 2 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll ask my questions to you, Ms. Latimer. And so, for the surveillance, there are programs, or different provinces that have these electronic surveillance programs. Quebec has one and has implemented its use throughout the province. Are you aware of such programs, and have you examined the Rebuilding Trust report from Quebec?
I have not examined that report, no. I'm unfamiliar with it.
OK. Intéressant parce que ce rapport-là a été fait d'une façon...
That's interesting because the report was done in a non-partisan way and was worked on by all political parties. I looked at the list of witnesses that were consulted. Elizabeth Colt, a judge from 2009 to 2016, Marie Fredette, Jean-Thierry Popiolet, coordinator, Clinique Carrette, Sylvain Guéret, Deborah Tren, social worker, Eliam Beaulieu, Julie Desrosiers, researcher, working at the Université de Laval, Michel Doré, works at the Université Laval, victim, Pierre Picard, consultant, who works in Indigenous Services, Alain Goudreau, Jean-Marc Bouchard, Madame Hélène Cadrin, specialist expert in domestic violence, Simon. And I'll end here, Madam Chair. A coordinator for a different group, and so they consulted a wide variety of people and had 190 recommendations. And
I'm going to now pass it over to Leah. Leah, 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. And I think just speaking about the committee today, I think, we have different perspectives, but I think we have a similar goal, which is to address violence I think in this case, particularly violence against women. My concern, though, in this is that I think we need more of an understanding about how this bill that's supposed to protect often criminalizes the victims, often BIPOC, like Black, Indigenous, and people of color victims, instead of helping them. They criminalize them. How does that happen? And you have a minute and 45 seconds.
Actually, a minute 20. We're on different clocks. Minute 20.
Okay. Okay.
I'm certainly not an expert in this, but I think that marginalized communities are less likely to be reliant on police. So if they start to get into a disagreement or an argument, there may be a tendency to want to fight back themselves, which will certainly lead to the double charging or the dual charging in domestic situations.
So going back to the systemic racism piece, because
Yes.
we know this through different reports, that's true, not going to police because of a history of systemic racism. Do you think this bill is premature because we haven't dealt with the current mess we're in?
You know, I would like to see us deal with that current mess, but I think we would get no legislation at all passed if we had to wait for the systemic racism issues to be addressed. I think we have to chip away at it and be mindful of the implications of any piece of legislation that's being passed in terms of its likelihood of exacerbating an already bad situation. And I think this bill might well do that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. On behalf of the committee, I would really like to thank Deepa
Chair?
and Kat. Oh, yes.
Sorry to interrupt for a
Go ahead.
quick. I would both witnesses offered really interesting amendments, and I would like through you for if they could submit them to this committee so that we
Absolutely.
could take those amendments into consideration
Absolutely.
very soon, please.
So if there is additional information that you'd like to send in and amendments, please send them in. We do have a deadline by next Wednesday at noon that everything has to be in, so that would be greatly appreciated. A couple comments. As I said, I would like to really thank the two. Thank you very much to Deepa and to Catherine for being here today. Just a couple comments. On Monday, we'll continue our consideration of the human trafficking study. Version 2 is going to be coming out any time, but we have got the conclusion and a few extra things done. So we'll be looking at that plus the recommendations. On Thursday, we will go back to the economic empowerment study. On Monday, we will do clause by clause, and on Thursday, we'll have Minister Ian. So if there's no further questions, I see today's meeting adjourned.
Thank you.